Hi, Ann. How are you?
Hey, John, good to hear from you.
Good evening, or
Good
good
morning
morning, good
here.
morning, or however you say good morning in Japanese. I don't
I
know
have no idea. It's
how
it's 11 a.m. here in Japan where I'm working. And what
right?
time is it for you and where are you?
I am at home in Virginia. It's 9:15 p.m.
Wow.
This is quite the logistical challenge.
We'll see if it works. It's a new
Right,
experiment for both of us
right.
connecting like
I mean,
this.
it's 9:15. I might fall asleep right in the middle of this. You never know. Or the kids
I
will
may
come in
too.
and be like, I can't sleep. Yeah.
Here's my cup of coffee. I'll send it to you virtually
Oh,
through
thank
the
you. All
screen.
right. I'm drinking my evening tea, so hopefully I put the right tea bag and it's not caffeinated and I'll be up all night. How are you? How you have been everywhere the
I
last few
have
months.
I have been everywhere. I have been to This is country number 8 in the past year, and I've got a couple more
Wow.
coming up. It's totally crazy. And a bunch of states, of course, but
Right.
I mean, you're a Dataviz trainer too. Our job takes us all over. So,
Everywhere. Yeah.
yep. Yep.
So why don't you give us so give me the quick list. Can you do the quick list of
I
where you've
think
been in the
so.
last few
I think
months?
so. They're going to be in a funny order because it's going to be chronological order. So in
Right.
2019, I went all over the US, of course, to teach in person, speak at
Right.
conferences. Canada, Guatemala, Zambia, Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, Japan. And
Right.
then in a few days, we go to Korea, then China just for a weekend for tourists, and then back to the
Sure.
US to
Right.
and who knows what 2020 has in store. That's kind of being
Yeah.
formed now.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wow.
But we don't fly in and out of places. Like we've been in Japan now for 5 weeks. So it's
Yes,
home.
that's
It's like
nice. Right.
me, husband, kids, and we have like a
Yeah.
home here, like a large
Right.
apartment to have normal life in addition to work life.
Yeah. So you bring everybody with you.
I do. I didn't used to do
That's
that.
nice.
That's new. So, yep.
How does that work out? Does your husband take the kids and you go off and work and then because they're not
Yep.
quite ready for school yet.
They're not quite ready for school. We have a year and a half till kindergarten starts. We have a 4-year-old and a
Okay.
1-year-old. So the husband, we did, I'm a spreadsheet person like you are. So we
Okay.
did this spreadsheet math a million different ways to take a very like calculated safe risk. Yeah, he
Yeah.
left his salaried government job almost a year ago to run what we call daddy school. So right
Right. Yeah.
now, so sometimes they're working from home. I use my nice noise canceling headphones. I just kind of like ignore what's going on in the other room of the home, and I just have my
Yeah.
home office set up just like I normally would, no matter where. It's like
Yeah.
the remote office goes with me. And on some recording days, like if I'm giving a webinar, I have a one-to-one coaching session, I'm going to do some recordings for an online course, I'm going to meet with you like this. They go out and they do field trips. And we just plan it a couple days in advance. And it's
Yeah.
actually pretty easy. So they're at the zoo right now. They're having like a normal preschool daddy daughter field trip just like they
Yeah.
normally would.
That's lovely.
We just happen to be in Japan doing that, but you do that in
Japan.
Fairfax. It's the same anywhere.
Yeah. Wherever. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm sure most of the animals are the same. There's probably cool animals
Oh,
there
I
though.
don't know. I have no idea. We'll see. We'll see. I'll see the
So
pictures later.
you're right. So when you're traveling these places, you're doing a lot of training, I would guess,
Hmm.
and then you've got I'm assuming you also got your regular like set of consulting work, and you've got
Hmm.
your online course.
Hmm.
And what else have you got going on besides all of that? Because that's not
That's
enough.
mostly it. Yeah, I divide it in my mind into the training side and the consulting
Yep.
side. So on the training end, I do my in-person speaking, which is usually a day-long workshop. Sometimes in Vietnam, I did 5 days of training, which is fantastic. Think of how many examples and hands-on practice you can do
Wow.
it in like a week together. It was like a conference. It was
Yeah.
amazing. It was the best case scenario.
Yeah.
In-person workshops. I do webinars, 60 to 90-minute webinars, mostly for professional societies if they
Hmm.
know their members are all over the US or all over the world. I do conference
Yeah.
talks. I do a few like big keynotes a year, online courses. I kind of lump in that training side. It's really unique though. We can talk about that. And then on the consulting side, that's, regular consulting, like revamping reports and slideshows and dashboards for groups.
Right.
So
Right.
I do the consulting work from anywhere with Wi-Fi connection,
Yeah.
and
Sure.
in between all of the in-person speaking. I build the online courses from anywhere.
Right. Well, let's talk about kind of both sides
Hmm.
because you're doing so much traveling, you've got some interesting, I think, perspectives on both sides. Um, Certainly on the training side, I'm sure you have some interesting thoughts on like cultural differences and
Yeah.
things that you've learned on the road. And then we can talk about the one thing I want to make sure I asked you about was the work that you do on report design? Because you spend a lot of time, you write a lot about that on your blog, which I always love to find those, because I just think that that's like a unique skill and a unique place to be, helping people do better specifically in designing their reports and doing Dataviz in the reports. But let's start on the training side, because I'm curious, are there big cultural things or big things you've learned traveling that's maybe different than outside the US or than inside the US?
There's so many differences, and they're all little nuances, and maybe they're going to be obvious to you. I made a whole list this morning of 9. So let's talk through a couple.
Okay.
And let's see.
All right, let's do it.
Tell me when you're like, this is so obvious, duh, and everybody knows this. You're just the dumb American who didn't know this. Or tell me when you're like, oh, I would have thought of that, because it's all new to me. Okay.
Right. Okay.
I've learned traveling and speaking around the world. And it's not just traveling this year too. I've been doing this role for 6 years now. So it's been a lot of workshops, as you know. So I have worked with interpreters. I've worked with sign language interpreters and foreign language interpreters, where people are wearing headsets. And that's an interesting scenario. So like thing number 1 I've learned, this is going to be obvious. You talk to the person, the participant in your class, you don't talk to the interpreter. I think most people know that, like whether it's a sign language interpreter or foreign language interpreter, like if somebody is in the audience and they ask a question, they might not know, they might like face their body and look at the interpreter. But when you respond as the trainer, as the speaker, you look at the person. Like even if the interpreter is speaking to the side of you in your ear, you still look at the person and maintain eye contact with them. Because as you know, communication is words, but it's also body language and tone and the speed of your voice. It's so many things that go into communication. So looking at the person is super respectful and helpful to both of you.
So I actually knew that one, but I have also a little tweak on that one. I had a friend in high school who was deaf. And whenever we would talk on the phone, we would talk through one of the services that would basically, the TTY service, where they would essentially type out what I was saying. And it took me I had to get through the first call to realize that I don't talk to the person who is doing that translation, right? I just talk to my friend, and the translation sort of happens on the side there. So
well, now you know.
Now I know. Yeah. So it Okay. So that's one. So translation, talk to people, still good.
Here's number 2, which I had to get over because this was not my preference. You have to share the training materials in advance so that the interpreter and the person needing the interpretation can review it. They know what your keywords are. They know if there's any new vocab words like data viz versus data visualization that they're not familiar with. They can see generally how you've broken up the day, like what you're going to cover first and second and third. It's just so helpful for them to have a heads up of what you're covering. And that I had to get over, because what I usually do is I print my course packets, the course manuals, and you just arrive, you sit down as the participant and it's just on the conference room table in front of you. Yeah. So you have to send that, a week in advance, at least a day in advance, so people can look through it. And the slides. So I know some of our trainer friends don't share slides after presentations. I share mine after presentations. Yeah. I don't think they're helpful because they're so minimal. It's not like I have full paragraphs on my slide. It's not meant to be that type of document. It's the slideshow. But it's just one more little thing that helps the person needing the interpretation to know what you're going to cover. Sharing materials in advance.
Good. So it's not like you are adding adding text to the slides or even in the notes of the slides for the interpreter translator to review. It's just that they get a sense of what you're going to talk about generally.
That would be the best case scenario.
Right.
I don't have speaking notes, and I definitely don't have like the full, I don't have a script written out underneath my slides. I've thought about paying one of my assistants to do that, where maybe she watches, how would I do that logistically? I'd have to record myself doing a training and she'd kind of transcribe it out. I think so. Yeah. That's not out of the question. That's definitely something that's on my radar that I probably should do at this level.
Yeah. I mean, seems like it certainly would help the interpreter. I guess it also helps people who can't make the session or miss part of the session. There's always those people who are like, oh, I really want to come, but I can only be there for the first couple of hours and then I have to leave. So, helps those people, I guess. Okay. So that's, we have 2 lessons.
Lesson number 3, talk with the interpreters ahead of time.
Mm.
You
When you're
have to,
there.
yes, when you're
Yeah.
there or a week ahead over Zoom or Skype, preferably ahead of time on some type of conference call or video call. So the first couple of times I worked with a sign language interpreter, like the very first time, it was for a university. I was in the big auditorium. There were a few hundred people there. I knew there would be 2 interpreters because the faculty and the students had requested it. I didn't know how many people needed an interpreter. I didn't know who they were, but I knew that there would be interpreters. I knew their names. I knew that they'd be 2 women. They'd be on the stage. Like, this was all communicated to me in advance. And I
Mm-hmm.
so appreciated that. So I knew what to expect when I arrived. And then I spoke with the interpreters ahead of time. We knew we were going to meet about an hour before the presentation so that I could show them my slides. I just had them come up to the podium and I was like, well, first I'm going to talk about this. And then I'm going to pause for an activity and it'll take about this long. And then here's the thing I'm going to talk about next, because they want to know what words they might need to spell out. Like, I don't know sign language, but if they had to like spell out letters of like
Right.
data visualization, if there's no symbol for
There's
that
no
or
sign for
sign
that.
for
Yeah.
that, then they need to know that in advance.
Yeah.
And they usually say things like, wow, you talk about data a lot and you talk about graphs a lot. They just need to know, like, what is this a biology presentation? Is it an
Yeah.
economics presentation? No, it's data visualization.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So that's the best case scenario, is to talk with them ahead of time.
Yeah.
Sometimes though, this happens. There's always a hiccup in every presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I get there and we're going to have, let's say it's a 9 a.m. start time. At 8:59, an interpreter comes over to me and says, hi, by the way, I'm an interpreter. I'm signing for a few people in the audience today. Can you give me a rundown of what you're going to cover?
At 8:59.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I do my best, and we start late. We start about 5 minutes
Right.
late because I think it's important to like try to give them as much of a rundown to make the day flow a lot smoother. But, again, best case scenario is you know in advance there's going to be an interpreter and you plan with them and you share the materials with them.
Huh. Okay. All right. So far we've covered language. I feel like this is like the first 3 rules around language.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So rule 4.
It's also language.
Language.
This is a harder one, though.
Okay.
This is, for me, more advanced. It's more of a nuance. Try to avoid slang and idioms.
That's a good one.
They're
got to be
everywhere.
tough.
They are so tough.
Yeah.
So there are phrases that you know what they mean. Like, I'll say, at the end of the day, ... But what does that mean to somebody who's speaking, who's a Vietnamese speaker, who English, I'm thinking of the interpreters I had in Hanoi a couple months ago. English is their 3rd or 4th language. They're very multilingual. They interpret from many different languages. And they're thinking, at the end of the day, what does that mean? So what I have to remind myself to say, this is very hard. I have to say, the most important thing I want you to remember is ... I just say like the literal translation as directly and succinctly as possible.
Wow.
Low-hanging fruit ... What that really means is the easiest edit to make to your graph is ... Not like, this is a low-hanging fruit edit. I used to say that a lot. I just say, here's the easiest edit.
Yeah.
Start here. Do this thing first.
So have you found other? So those are 2 really good ones. Have you caught yourself doing other ones that I would guess that, practice it, like listen to yourself talk, you catch all of your weird ticks, that maybe other people don't catch. Like, have you caught other ones? I'm trying to think of ones that I would say that is a really interesting one.
I really have to think about it because they are everywhere in our language.
Yeah.
It's so natural to us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Okay. All right. So 4, we've got a lot of language. We sticking with language for number 5?
More language. Contractions. Try not to speak in contractions. Instead of saying, don't do this thing, don't have 3D exploding pie charts with 50 slices. The NT on don't, and many people, it kind of trails off. It's a little bit silent. There's a noise in the room. There's a noise outside the office building, like there always is. There's some noise. The people hear the do, but they don't hear the NT at the end. It just kind of trails off. So instead of saying, don't do this thing, say, do not do this thing. And you have to emphasize the not with both your voice and your hands. Like, do not use 3D pie charts, or avoid 3D pie charts.
So have you used that? So that particular technique seems like it would work it would also work in the U.S. or Canada. So have you
Mm-hmm.
found yourself sticking with that technique when you're back in the States?
I try to, because
Yeah.
of the poor audio quality in most speaking environments. Like
Mm-hmm.
once in a while I get super lucky. There's the perfect mic setup. There's the perfect speaker setup. The stage or the room I'm speaking in has just the perfect acoustics.
Yeah.
But 99% of the time there's some like weird thing about the room or there's no microphone available, which is really helpful. Like microphones can help so much with those kind of quieter sounds. So it's, what's been interesting too, it's made me as a trainer get crystal clear about what I'm recommending people do and don't. I think
Mm-hmm.
flashback to Anne 5 years ago, I was more generous, where I'd say, oh, well, it's probably the best case scenario to do this, or well, the research is mixed on this thing.
Yeah,
So in the
yeah.
meantime, I don't know, you could maybe do this thing or this other thing in your graph. And now I have to take a stand. I have to
Uh-huh.
say, I recommend that you do this. And here's
Huh.
why.
Okay. All right.
Or the research is mixed, but I recommend that you do not do this one thing. And you
Right.
emphasize it, because people will take better notes that way. They're going to have better
Mm-hmm.
guidance. So that's challenging. It's not just a
Yeah.
speech thing of saying don't
No,
or
right.
do not.
Yeah.
It's a planning issue and a clarity of message issue.
Right. Right. Okay. So I want to come back to that later, because I want to hear what you think are your most controversial do's and do nots.
Oh
So,
no. Okay.
yeah. All right. Well, we'll come back to that. Okay. So we've got. So we're on tip number 6.
This is a little one. I
All
think
right.
it matters though. I've noticed this speaking in Southeast Asia. Try to avoid religious phrases. For example, if I'm speaking and I have my clicker, my laser pointer in my hand, and it flies out of my hand, which happens once in a while, my instinct, what I would normally say is, "Oh my goodness," or "Oh
Yeah.
my gosh."
Right.
That has no translation to somebody who's not in a Judeo-Christian culture. What do
Hmm.
they mean? Do they mean like I'm thinking of the translator. I'm putting myself in the translator's shoes. Okay, Anne just said, "Oh my goodness." I want to translate that, even though it's not part of the like official presentation for the audience. They try to
Yeah.
translate everything to make it feel more natural and real. So are they thinking that's a good thing that the clicker just
Right.
fell out of her
Yeah.
hand
Just
and
flew out of her
flopped on the
hand. Yeah.
floor? So
Yeah.
I just try to say, "Oh no,"
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
or "Oops, that's not good." I try to
Yeah.
be as literal as possible.
Okay. So the one, okay. So I have one that I've picked up from Andy Kirk, but I want to because it touches on the religious thing, but maybe it might
Okay.
be one of your 9. So I'll hold off.
Hmm.
Okay. So we'll stay away from the religious stuff, which is probably just a generally like good rule of thumb.
It is.
Anyways.
It is. And
Yeah.
when I was writing this one down, I thought I should just try to speak without any phrases
Yeah.
like that. I don't know if
Yeah.
there's any I do beyond "oh my goodness" or "oh my gosh." I really have to think about that one. So anybody listening,
Yeah.
tweet at us
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Tweet us. Yeah. I
let
don't
us
know.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's a good one. Number 7.
This is really hard to do, and this might be a little controversial. Try to avoid speaking with an accent.
Ooh, that is going to be a tough one.
You and I are both from the DC area, or
Yeah.
or have been there for many
Have
years.
lived there. Yeah.
In
Right.
my opinion, this is the controversial type. In my opinion, you and I don't have accents,
Mm-hmm.
but for other parts of the US, we do. Also, when I'm around people from the South, because I grew up in Virginia, I can get a little bit of a Southern drawl, not much,
Right.
not like somebody who's actually from the South, since I'm from Northern Virginia, but when I'm around those people, I kind of code switch accidentally
Yeah.
and I speak a
Comes
little bit
out.
more
Yeah.
Southern.
Right.
When I'm around people of my same age range, we talk about the same memes, or we might accentuate something in our speech. There's just a little bit different language pattern that I kind of
Yeah.
fall into naturally, where
Right.
you're trying to blend in with people around you, but then you have to like not do that and not speak with an accent at all.
Hmm.
I've heard when I was speaking in Guatemala, one of the fellow instructors was from Georgia and definitely had the classic Georgia Southern accent. And I
Yeah.
remember people saying like, "What was she saying there?" Like other fellow participants were asking me, "What was she saying? What was she saying?" And I was kind of trying to translate in my Washington, D.C.
Right.
accent.
Washington.
So
Right. Not the Washington accent. The
not
Washington
that one,
accent. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Washington
Not that
accent.
one. So that's interesting because I would guess, and really not knowing much about languages, I could ask my wife, who's knows everything about languages, is around here somewhere. I would guess that a lot of people who are learning English, for example, as their second language, they're probably learning it from someone who also has a fairly neutral or no accent, right? So if I was native Spanish speaker in Guatemala and I learned English from someone from Georgia with the Southern twang, right, that sound would be natural to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Or are you learning British English?
Right. Or using, right. Exactly. Right.
In Asia, Australia is still like a 10-hour flight away from here. But are you learning Australian English? Because that's the majority of tourists you see are either from Hawaii or Portland or LA, like the West Coast part of the US, or they're from Australia. I don't know. It's just these little things
that's interesting. Yeah, these little things. Yeah.
Little things that you can have very smart, hardworking people, very highly educated people in your audience, but they're just like working so hard to understand the Dataviz content if you don't try to do these things.
Right. If they're trying to decipher your voice as well. Yeah, that's a big challenge. Yeah. That's a good one. That's another good one. Okay. Number 8.
Do use body language. If you're
so I'm guessing I've seen you speak, so you use body language, make it clear. And I'll let you dive into this a little more, but I am curious. Is there any body language that you also avoid? So you've already talked about some things when in your language that you try to avoid. Are there body language things that you also avoid?
Yes. I watch YouTube videos before I go to a new country on like how to not be an awful American when you're traveling.
Right.
Cultural cues that you should know ahead of time that I think just being a responsible, respectful traveler, you should know. So I've learned a couple. With the body language, just to be clear, it's not just talking with your hands. It's things like in data visualization, if you're recommending that they do this thing, you nod your head up and down. You smile with your face and your eyes as you're talking about this wonderful thing you want people to start doing. You might, as cheesy as it feels doing it even right now, you might give them a thumbs up sign so that they know this is a good thing. So it's crystal clear because they might be listening to you through a headset as the foreign language interpreter is speaking with a little bit of delay. They're also watching your slides. They're also looking at the handout. So like all these cues I think really matter. Thumbs up is interesting though, because they do it in Japan. I think I first learned this in Vietnam. Instead of thumbs up, they do what we call the OK symbol. They touch their thumb and their forefinger. So when you're doing a training here, you say, yes, do this thing. And you do an OK symbol and you smile just to make it very, very clear. You are recommending they do this thing.
Wow.
And when you're the opposite, do you want to know how people say, do not do this thing? Like I just did it with my hands. If people are watching the video of this.
Like the small, like safe symbol in baseball. Right?
In Japan.
I mean, that's how if you're not watching the video. In Japan, you make an X.
You make an X. You cross your arms. You touch your hands at the wrists. And that's very normal. And at first, the first time I encountered it, we were at Disney World over the holidays in Tokyo. And the Disney World operator was saying, no, you have to take your 1-year-old out of the Ergo Baby carrier on your chest and put her in the seat next to you. And she's motioning all of this. She's kind of motioning to the baby in the carrier. And she does this X and smile. And kind of nods, like, don't do this, because she's a polite Disney employee. And they're not being rude. They're just saying, like, for safety reasons, no, X. But you see it among cashiers. You see it in the business world and in offices. That's just what they do to mean, don't do this. It's not rude in any way. It's just what they do.
Right. That's just a symbol. All right. Okay. Wow. Okay. So number 9.
This is the most fun one for Dataviz. You have to find non-U.S. examples. You can't just show U.S. maps. You have to show world maps.
Yeah.
If you're talking about, I do a lot of projects now with finance and accounting people and talking about project budgets. And you can't just have U.S. dollars on your slides. You have to have different currencies, preferably their country's currency. If you're showing examples from a newspaper or from the nightly news, any type of current event, you have to show world events. It can't be US-centric events.
Yeah, that's really good.
I've learned this the hard way. I wish I would have known this earlier on. This is probably the most important one, actually, out of the entire list, to find non-US examples.
Do you find them hard to find? I mean, I can name several places that I go to fairly regularly. but I spend I'm in the U.S. I'm in a political policy world most of the day, so I'm spending most of my time with the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. But have you sort of figured out or found your international places that you go now, or is it just like hoping to get lucky?
So think of all of our European Dataviz friends, anything that they're tweeting or liking, look to those publications. So I'm thinking anything that Andy Kirk is tweeting, I'm sure I haven't stalked his Twitter channel in a while. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm sure he's sharing examples from throughout Europe.
Yeah.
Or other people might tend to have examples from Asia or from Latin America. So you can look to those publications, but more and more, the more I train, I've created my own examples. So if I have an example of like, here's how to do color coding on a map, I make sure I have the US map for the US audiences, and I might have a map of South America when I'm going to speak in South America, or a map of Europe if I'm going to speak in Europe. So just creating my own generic map examples. It takes a lot of time. It's not something you can do the night before your presentation. It's like an ongoing practice to become a better, more like just a better American traveling abroad.
A better American. Okay, so those are great. I want to add one. I don't know where I would slot it. It's going to be, number something A. I heard this from Andy Kirk. Andy Kirk keeps coming up in this conversation, and we'll tell everybody why in a moment. So I heard either through Twitter, we were chatting about it. He did a workshop or a tutorial or something in, I think, the United Arab Emirates. And he had his just like we both have, we have our little agenda for the day. But what he didn't remember to take into account was prayer time, which I thought was a really interesting, cultural difference that, certainly not something that would be off the top of my head. That'd be like, oh, I got to make sure I break these break these things out. So I would guess there are other sorts of cultural things that you probably have to build into your agendas for different times with prayer or this or that you have to consider that, probably for most of us just comes with, making the mistake and learning from it.
Well, hopefully this podcast will fast forward people and propel them a little bit more. The prayer time is so interesting because I've actually had that in the U.S. with religious groups that I've worked with.
Oh, sure.
I've had that a few different times. They tell me in advance. They say prayer time is always 10 to 10:15 or whatever. So I haven't had that working internationally yet. I've just had that in the U.S. I'm thinking I worked with a Catholic church group, and another group was a foundation that gave money to orphanages and church-based orphanages around the world. So they had prayer time built in. They invite you to come to their prayer time with you. You can go or not. It's very like they don't care either way. Yeah. Oh, okay. Here's an obvious one. I can't believe I didn't think of this one. When you're making an agenda, you have to remember that most people are in 2400 like military time.
Yeah, right.
Which is so hard. I mess that up all the time.
It's so not American.
What is 3 p.m.? 3 p.m. is whatever time it is to most people.
Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah, that's not our thing. Yeah.
It's very unnatural to me.
Yeah. Those are good. Those are really good. Should we tell our Andy Kirk story now, or should we talk about formatting reports first?
Andy Kirk. That's so much more fun than formatting reports, isn't it?
I don't know if does Andy know this story?
I don't know.
We'll have to just tell Andy to listen to this episode.
Listen up, Andy.
Do you want to? Yeah, Andy, pay attention. Do you want to start this story?
Well,
our story of how we met.
John and I have known each other a while.
A long time.
Yeah. I want to say 8 years now. 8 years? Does that sound right?
I want to say, 2010, 2011, something like that.
So maybe longer.
Maybe longer. I think longer. Yeah. Andy was in town, right, doing his workshop, and we both attended, didn't know each other, right? And somehow we ended up having lunch with Andy, the three of us. And then we became fast friends. And and we were also like basically around the corner from each other, started hanging out. But it's just kind of weird because we didn't who knew that we would both end up changing jobs and getting so neck deep into the Dataviz world at
Who
the
knew?
time.
I never could have predicted this.
No.
Also, and I think another interesting twist on that story is, you meet a lot of cool people when you attend trainings or conferences, and maybe you keep in touch with them, but maybe you didn't.
Yeah,
So
right.
it wasn't like we met and we said, let's be best friends for the next decade and collaborate on projects. We'll have this John and Ann, like awesome energy. We kind of re-met on Twitter then later, I think,
Yeah.
because maybe I realized that you actually worked not too many metro stops away from where I
Yeah.
worked at the time, and we kind of reconnected, and then we'd have lunch over and over
Right.
the years.
Yeah.
And
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it may have actually taken us a while to connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
That we actually that's where we met. I feel like we reconnected on Twitter, and then it took a while for us to be like, now hold on a second. Have we had lunch at this place before? Because I feel like I've eaten here with Andy Kirk before and one other person. So I don't know if Andy keeps track of all the friendships he produces at his workshops, but that's one of them. So,
This is a good one.
good job, Andy. Okay, let's talk about let's talk about two more things, because we want to keep because it's getting time for bed over here. So let's talk about formatting reports, because I find it to be one of the more unique things that you write about, because I don't think a lot of people are actually doing it, or at least I'm sure less people are doing it, but they're not writing about their process, and you get out there and talk about your process and how you think about it. So I don't really think I have like a specific question other than to just say, how do you approach working on reports and making them just better and more visual and, easier to read? So that's like open door. Enjoy.
I am so surprised that you have this impression of my work and my blog, to be honest, because reports for me, it's just, I work with a variety of groups now. So I work with government, federal, state, local, some more like international types of groups that work across many countries. I work with foundations. I work with NGOs. I work with universities. I work with library systems. Like, it's a little bit of everybody, for-profits, nonprofits, like I mentioned, some religious groups in there. And in a perfect world, they would have very short, succinct reports in addition to many other formats, in addition to something I want to ask you about, the pyramid shaped thing that you're working on.
Yeah.
About what types of dissemination formats appeal to what types of audiences. So in a perfect world, if time permitting, skills permitting, people would have the report and the slideshow version, and they'd have the multiple handouts, and they'd have the infographic, and they'd have the social media images, and they'd have the
whole
news release, they'd have the podcast release, this entire broad communication strategy for getting their data into the world, getting their research out into policy decisions. But that's the case in some groups. I definitely see in every group a desire to do that. It's just not in practice happening yet. So it's like, well, in the meantime, you're still going to have your report, or you're still required to write your report because your boss requires it, because that's the way it's always been, or you get funding from a foundation or a federal agency and you have to write a report. So it's like, in the meantime, let's write good reports. Let's make them better. And gosh, trying to think of things I've specifically blogged about, because like you, I have so many examples I can't blog about. It takes a lot of energy to like either get permission to blog about a certain process, or to anonymize it on a blog post.
I can't conjure up a specific post, but like I've definitely seen you write about things like putting in, using colors, using breakers for things like, don't just have, I don't know, chapter 2 is like instead of 12-point font, it's now in 14-point font, like make a nice page with a picture. And then another one that I think you've used is how to use icons and objects and images in the body of the text, so that it, and I think, I do have like a vague memory of recollection of images you put up, where, I'll put it this way. My editor at my publisher has always talked about trying to get rid of what he calls the word wall, right? It's like you open the book and it's just 2 pages of, 12-point font text, just, And especially when you're doing visual content, it just seems like a lot all of a sudden to be faced with this page of text. And you just have this approach where you're breaking it up. So it's still, maybe it's instead of 2 pages, it's 2.5, but it's broken up in a way that just seems easier to read.
Yeah. So the first technique you mentioned, I call color coding by chapter. And it's the idea that you still might have a long report. I'm thinking of a recent example I worked on with a public health group, a state public health group, and it was still going to be a 100-page report. Would I have loved for it to be a 20-page report or multiple 20-page reports? Of course. That wasn't realistic. Maybe even 5 years from now that might be happening, but not for this particular project. So we knew it's still going to be really lengthy. So we had to make it easy for people to find the information they wanted. Maybe some people want the opioid chapter. Other people want the maternal health chapter. Other people want the environmental toxins chapter, depending on like which community groups are going to be using this data, usually in their grant making or decision making. So what you do is you look at, I recommend people use their branding colors and they don't just find random colors.
Yeah.
So we look at their logo and their website and they have 2 or 3 or 4 branding colors on there. Let's just say it's like a blue, a turquoise, a purple, and a red. Okay, I'm thinking of this recent report again. So chapter 1 is in the first brand color. Chapter 2 is in the second brand color. And by saying it's in that brand color, I mean, you might have a full bleed photo starting that chapter saying it's chapter 1, it's the introduction. I often do an overlay on top of that photo to like, I'll use a black and white photo. And then I literally in Word, I don't use any fancy software. I'm super anti, like you need fancy software to do this.
Yeah.
Everyday products as you do. And I put a rectangle on Word in Word on top of it to make it the blue from their logo.
Yeah.
And then all the words in that chapter, the heading 1s, the heading 2s, call out boxes are the blue. So it's a very blue chapter. The graphs have blue. They may be a gray and blue graph. So people know you're in chapter 1. And then you're scrolling, or maybe you're flipping through a printed booklet and all of a sudden you get to turquoise and your brain says the color changed. Therefore, the content must have changed. It's a turquoise full bleed photo, turquoise heading 1s, turquoise heading 2s, turquoise is the call out on the graphs. It's so simple when you see it. It's so powerful. It takes a couple hours to do because you're literally like clicking on text to change the color.
Right, change the colors, right.
But it's worth it. I think it's the best use of people's time if they just have a couple hours of time.
It's funny. I was about to ask, and I knew what the answer would be. I was about to ask, do you do this all in InDesign or Illustrator? And I knew you would. I knew, just because we share the same sort of ethos and approach. And I was talking to a designer once who's a PowerPoint MVP, and she said, you can do a lot of stuff in Microsoft Word. You just have to make it look like it wasn't made in Microsoft Word. Like that's just like you said, the full bleed, like that alone does now not look like a Microsoft Word product. Yeah.
And I'm sure that I could learn a publisher or Adobe products. I've dabbled in them. I know you could learn these. It's just that Word's the common denominator as Excel is and PowerPoint. So if I know these reports are always a collaboration, it's not just me doing it and I say, okay, here's your report. It looks completely different from where we started. I hope you adopt it and keep these practices in your organization. No, of course not. It's a full collaboration from start to finish, at least at the beginning, to kind of brainstorm ideas together and show them examples from other projects. So it has to be made in a software program where they can run with it after I pass the baton over. It has to be something they can use themselves.
Right, exactly. So if you're going to require them to learn the Adobe suite and get InDesign, you're adding more costs and time. Whereas if they're a Microsoft shop, teach them how to use those tools.
Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Wait, John. I have a funny story about this though. And this is a request for the readers.
All right.
I thought I knew where I learned this concept of color coding by chapter. It is not mine. I thought I learned it from, do you know who's a presentation design expert who's based in Japan?
I do. I know who you're talking about.
Gar Reynolds, who has several books. He's got Presentation Zen. He's got Presentation Zen Design, who I got to meet yesterday.
Oh, nice. And he's got Naked Presenter.
Yes, I haven't read that one yet. I've read the two
Okay, I read that one.
presentations and Zen ones. We're just like, we met up for coffee. Apparently, by chance,
Yeah.
I am, a few metro stops from where he lives, which,
Yeah.
what a wonderful coincidence. So we're just like hanging out at a park bench, watching my kids play on the playground as my husband's watching them.
That's great.
And he brought me the his new presentation Zen. I'm like looking at it over here. Just came out. I think it's the 3rd edition, maybe. And I'm telling him, oh, my favorite thing about this book is that it's color coded by chapter. I learned this from you and I teach it and it's amazing. And he's like, actually, that's not this book. So I don't know where I learned that from. In my mind, like 10 years ago, I got this idea from him. It might be the presentations and design book, might be the kind of the flip-flopping from chapter. So if anybody knows where I learned this, I don't want to take credit for this. I think it's a brilliant concept, but it's just something that I hope universally we kind of all adopt.
Yeah.
Chapter 1, this color.
Well,
chapter 2, the next color.
You certainly didn't learn it from me because my book only came out in 2016. But I do it in my presentation book. I do that same approach, and it's
awesome.
It's more subtle than the way you've described it. So the way mine breaks out, it's like there's a header page. Chapter 3. There's a big 3 in a triangle, and that triangle is red, and the facing page is red, and then you just go into the rest of the text, and the headers in red. But the lines that separate the image from the caption is just like a very thin red line. So then there's a purple chapter and a blue chapter. So I like that approach too. I'm thinking, I wonder if it's Nancy Duarte's book.
It could be.
Yeah, it's a great approach. I agree. It's great. And it's so easy to implement.
Yep.
Okay. So let me ask this. So back to where we started. What are some of the things you tell people to do and not to do that you think are the more controversial things? Let's see if we can get you in a little bit of trouble.
Controversial things. Oh my gosh.
So I've already heard you say no 3D.
You.
I've already heard you say no 3D pie charts.
Just stirring the pot. Just stir it up. Okay, this is probably the most controversial for your audience. I'm thinking of. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking. The more academic audience who's very aware of their research, very sophisticated on Dataviz knowledge, which I definitely work with those people. But I also work with the regular people where their role is data analyst or something, or maybe their role is data visualization, or their role is not data. And they just want to know, like, maybe the research is mixed, but like, what should I do in the meantime? They need very clear guidance because this might be the only Dataviz training that they ever take. So I can't like let them walk out of the room with this fuzzy sense of like, I have no idea how to implement this because I don't know what to do. So this is probably the most controversial. I teach them that pie charts are okay in some circumstances. Many people say pie charts are the devil. They're horrible. You can never use them. They're so bad. You're like laughing at me because this is so. You're like, are you?
No, but I totally agree with you. I 100% agree. But I'm laughing because yes, there are a lot of people who are, they're shaking their fists at us right now. But I totally agree with you. There are.
And just to clarify, I have many blog posts on this topic. I have a list of 7 criteria. Don't ask me to name them. I don't have them memorized, but you basically get to the bottom of the list and I say, okay, so like, don't do this. Like it can't be 3D. It needs to be 2D. And, don't do that. Don't have a separate legend. It needs to be directly labeled, which if you're familiar with Dataviz, you're like, well, of course the no 3D rule applies to many, many circumstances, but you get to the bottom and I say, when it is okay to use pie charts, it's not that you're never going to use pie charts. They're a familiar chart. Your audience loves them, especially if you have a non-technical audience. It's not that you'd never use this great familiar chart that they love. When it's just 2 slices that's it. Just a 2-slice pie chart. It's 2D. It's not 3D. It's directly labeled. So it would be like people who live in urban areas versus everybody else combined, like the dark slice of those people you're focusing on versus everybody else in gray, or people who graduated high school on time versus everybody else combined. Not the 3 slice, not the 10 slice, the simple, clear cut overview pie chart. I'm okay with those. I
even take it a step further. So I now we're getting into a pie charts conversation, but we'll cut it off because there's people who are just rolling their eyes at us right now. So I have, so for the 2-slice pie chart, I agree with you, but I'm also in some instances saying, do you really need a pie chart? Like, do you need a graph, right? Because if you show me that 1 slice, it's 10%, like just tell me it's 10%. I don't know if I need a graph. So my rule of thumb is no more than 3 slices that you're going to focus on, and that those 3 slices sum to one of the 3 following numbers: 25%, 50%, or 75%.
Mm-hmm.
Because those hit those right angles that we are familiar
Yep.
with. So if you're saying, the sum of groups A, B, and C are slightly more than 50%, so you might have 4 slices in your pie chart, but 3 of them are the darker colors, and then the rest is gray or whatever.
Yes.
And you can sort of see how it's easy for us
Yes.
to see it past 50%. Those
Absolutely
are my
agree. I call this familiar fractions. So I do the 25,
Oh, yeah,
50,
nice.
75. I would also
Yeah.
include the 1/3, 2/3, like a 33%, a 66% in my mind also fall in there, because I think you can visually, who knows what a 10% looks like versus a 15%.
No, right.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
But if it's one of
Absolutely.
those common breakpoints, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm totally cool with
Nice.
those. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me ask one more just to get your take, because it's a topic of interest for me right now. So what is your take on 0 axis for the vertical axis in a bar chart? I'm going to get you on record.
Okay. Before we started recording, I told you I had just listened to one of your podcasts this morning, the most recent one that was published. Now, by the time our conversation is published, there might be several more. And the woman was like the researcher on this.
Yeah. She's just done a paper on it. Yeah.
However, I listen to podcasts as I get ready. So I had my phone sitting on this little cart next to the shower. Right. So I don't know what she said, because I had the water blaring on me. There's echoey noise. Whatever she said, I would do that. And I feel like you are more of a purist in this than I am.
I think I am still. I just, for me, and the paper's really interesting. And I think for me, one paper doesn't prove one way or the other. And so basically her recommendation is to have this, 1.5, I think it's 1.5 standard deviations is where you sort of pick your cutoffs. For me, I just feel like I'm not convinced, right? Like I'm still anxious about starting
You're said like a true researcher, Jon.
But I mean, there are still, there are smart people out there smart people out there talking about, what to do about this, and the arguments are they're solid arguments. So
no, I do have very clear guidance on this. So this is my take that I tell people in my workshops. I say, you must label the minimum and the maximum. And I didn't always used to feel like that. I used to tell people, if it starts at 0 and it goes to 100%, don't worry. That's kind of the norm, is 0 up to whatever the max is.
Right.
I changed my tune after the last election cycle, because I felt like people were purposefully in news outlets misleading us one way or the other, or in different publications. So now I say, we are not lying with statistics. No way. We are trying to be truthful and unbiased and honest about the data, of course, which I've never met anybody in my workshops who's trying to lie with statistics. Everybody has very good intentions, very good intentions. And I say, just to be safe, to just prove to people we're not trying to mislead them, I want you to label the min and the max. And I tell them the best practice is to start at 0. And I joke with them, because these are not Dataviz people. I don't know if the people in my workshops will ever listen to this podcast. I'll tell them it exists, but I don't know if they're going to listen. They could care less about these conversations that people like us love having.
Right.
And I tell them, just so you know, there's a thriving, lively debate in the Dataviz community about this issue. Yeah. The research is mixed, because I want to let them know that there is a community of people. Yeah. There's a Dataviz society. There's books on this topic. There, maybe not in this particular research study, but on data visualization. And I say, the research is mixed. I don't care if you start at 0 or not, but I want you to label it, because I want you to be truthful and accurate.
Right. I think the term, the phrase best practice or rule of thumb is probably the one that still applies, as opposed to a rule. I think we're starting, just like I kind of feel like the field did with pie charts. We kind of moved away from this rule that no pie charts ever. And maybe we're seeing the start of this period where we'll move away from the 0 axis, but I'm not there yet. And I know Chad Skelton's probably listening to this podcast, shaking his fist at me, because he's one of these leading voices to make us think a little bit harder about this. So, but he now just have to keep fighting it out.
Well, that's tricky too, when you're in the training role like we are, versus the trainee role, which is 99% of the world. And for us, it's like you need to know the rules so that you know when to break them. But
Yes.
communicating those nuances to a workshop group that may or may not have any prior Dataviz knowledge,
Yeah.
it's really tricky. So I feel like as the trainer, it is your job to be like, let them know that there's some debates, but also they have to leave with very clear guidance on what's okay and what's not.
Yeah.
And I'll tell people too, like I'll tell you now, if you look back at past blog posts from like 2012, go back several hundred blog posts, I'm sure you'll see blog posts where I haven't labeled the minimum and maximum,
Mm-hmm.
but now I do. And I definitely recommend that other people label the min and the max as well.
Yeah. It's good to evolve with the field, which is, we're all learning.
Yep.
Wow. We talked for a while. Thanks.
I know. I could talk all day or all night
all day.
for you, but
well,
I know
all
you've got other things.
I've got other things. Well, thanks for taking time out. And enjoy it. Now, let me ask this. So the kids and your husband are at the zoo.
Mm-hmm.
What's the weather like there?
It's cold. It's very similar to DC, 40s during the day, whatever that means in Celsius. I don't know. It's cold.
So that's another one.
Weather.
That's another one. You just picked up another one, right?
Absolutely.
Like going from Fahrenheit to Celsius. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one. That's a good last way to end this.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much, Ann. That was fun.
Thanks, John. Bye. Good night.
Bye.